4-lecture unit, which we'll talk about general principles of development today, and then go over indices of development, dealing with the biological aspects, the cognitive aspects, and the social aspects. Today is a general intro. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can all kind of get integrated. Now, when we kind of left off last time, and if you didn't come to our last lecture for culture and diversity, we had talked about taking the intercultural developmental inventory. I had a division meeting this morning. They decided not to fund that test for this class. However, I'm willing to pay for it myself. I've got some professional development dollars, so you'll see an email coming from me tonight. If that's an instrument that you want to take, then I'd be happy to send you out a code. Next week, remember, September 28th, your projects are due, intro projects. It is a scheduled walk for my undergraduate classes. Okay, if you're in the 500 or 501 section, you don't have class. If you choose to take the IDI, I'm going to have you come for the first 15 minutes just to unpack those results. So I should have those codes ready to distribute probably about Wednesday. I'd be happy to provide this for you. This is not out of my own personal wallet. This is out of money that I've accumulated in professional development dollars. I really want to provide that information to you. So if you're interested in that, I'll have that code. Just need to take it before and then come for the first 15 minutes on that Monday. If you're choosing not to take that, that's fine. Your project is due eCampus submission on Monday, survey design project. Graduate students, you will meet. That is your day that we're covering your intro to development project. So I'll have the rubric and all the expectations for that. So you have to be here regardless, whether you're attending face-to-face or whether you're attending via Zoom. So anyway, I'll be happy to facilitate that discussion. So look for an email tonight. You've got about 24 hours to answer. So once that goes out, Qualtrics poll, do I want to take it? Do I not want to take it? I'll order the codes, and then you should have it before the end of the week. Just take it. It takes about 45 minutes to take. You need to sit down and really kind of concentrate on that because it's going to be an accurate representation of where you're currently at. We had a lot of good discussion over that. If you weren't here on Wednesday, you missed mega opportunity for bonus points. I think Group 4 cleaned up with 6 points. So anyway, never miss a chance to participate. You can always earn points to boost your grade and standing in class this semester. This unit, this is not to scare anybody. This is just reality. This is the one that has the most content, and it's the one in which the test typically ends up with the scores that are not the highest. You guys did amazing as a class on your very first intro test. I think as a whole, the average was about a 26 out of 30. So you're talking about just under a 90%. That's phenomenal. There were more perfect scores than there were almost anything else. I mean, you guys did really, really well on that. I don't want that to be a false sense of security. That's a great start. And many of you actually have above 100% average now with participation points and React grades and those type of things. Just keep up the good work. And I will tell you, being in lecture for this unit is the best way to max out a grade. As I told you guys, I'm going to deviate a little bit from the book. It's my job to kind of make this information more meaningful. I'm not going to sit here and read you the woeful textbook. I'm really going to hopefully make this information more pertinent and more relevant to you guys as future child professional services students, graduate students, and whatever your major is. So with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and start. I'm going to get this. It looks like I don't have the PC screen on. That's better for y'all right there. So it looks like the way I've got this viewed is just kind of a series of slides. I don't have the ability to take it full screen, but should work for purposes of today. Development. Terms, types, trends. We're going to give you a general definition of development. And this is a development definition that can be used as a framework. Doesn't mean it's the correct, one right definition of development. Development is a construct viewed in many different ways. But I'll give you what your book gives you as a guideline for development, and we'll use that to unpack some characteristics of this term. So development, first of all, is a pattern of changes that occur in humans across the lifespan. A pattern of changes that occur in humans across the lifespan. A pattern of changes that occur in humans across the lifespan. That's what I'm going to give you. I mean, we could unpack and talk about a lot of different indices and aspects of development, which we will in this unit. But the one thing I want you to kind of focus in on for today is patterns, stages, sequences, those aspects that we can view and follow as a developmental trajectory. progression. And one of the ways we can do that is distinguishing between two terms that you might have used as synonyms for the longest time: development and maturation. Today, we're going to provide kind of a little bit of a differentiation between those two, because even though they really kind of speak to the same aspects, the types of functioning from a development perspective they speak to are different. So first of all, here's one of the main patterns of development. So this goes with development. First of all, developmental changes, when they occur, they appear in orderly ways. They appear in orderly ways. Now, for every indices of this, I'm going to give you an S term. And the S term I'm going to use to describe this is systematic. Developmental changes, the patterns that we observe and see, appear in orderly ways. They can be characterized as systematic. The next aspect about these changes, they follow this pattern, they are systematic. The other term is that they are sustained. They remain or endure for long periods of time. Remain or endure for long periods of time. We don't regress, but the developmental changes that occur remain in place. Now notice, I'm stopping short of using the word permanent, because we know that there can be declines in developmental abilities. But for the most part, once you've undergone a change, a physical change, a cognitive change, a social redefinition, those remain in place. They're not permanent, but they are sustained. So development, the way we characterize this broad characterization of development, is systematic and sustained changes that occur across the lifespan. Now we're going to pinpoint in this unit biological changes, cognitive changes, and social changes. We also will have special indices of development, which we will call maturation. Maturation is a type of development. Maturation refers to changes that occur naturally that have a lot to do with genetic or nature-based influences. Changes that occur naturally, they are genetically programmed, and they are changes that are due to nature. Now, the two S's that we can give for maturation. First of all, because of individual differences, maturational changes can be characterized as spontaneous. They can suddenly appear. In this unit, we'll talk about pubertal changes. And I know from my perspective, I would have loved to have known when I was speaking when my voice would crack because of the lengthening of my vocal cords. That's a maturational change that you can point to that occurs unpredictably. Even though it follows a sequence and a pattern, you know generally when in your developmental pattern or trajectory that will occur, but you don't know the specific date, time. Maturational changes. They're spontaneous. Ladies, same thing. You would have loved to have known when your first menstrual cycle was going to occur. That's a specific change you can point to. It's a maturational aspect. It's indices of development, but there was no predicting that. A function of what? Genetics and a lot of the environment influences as well. Those are aspects of maturation. Now the other aspect, it's spontaneous and it's specific. It's not this holistic change. It points to vocal cord changes, ovulation changes, specific indices, indications of development. Whereas development is considered a broader term, maturational changes show that development is occurring. And there are differences in individuals on a developmental spectrum. So even though that you might have two 13-year-olds that look very different, sound very different, think very different, they're still following that same pattern. They just have the aspect of individual differences. That means that their maturational levels are different. Differences between development and maturation. Now, in this unit, we're going to profile 3. Man, you could spend an entire course on this, and you could, in psychology and other sociology as well, learning all about biological development. We offer courses in our EPSY department, one on child development, one on adolescent development, that really pinpoint these changes in greater context. We're going to spend a day on each. So as you can imagine, we're not going to be able to get very deep. We're going to present a couple of theories, an overview, indications that you can use when you're working with kids, when you're out collecting data, looking at trends, and those type of aspects. But when we talk about cognitive changes, we're talking about changes in thinking, language acquisition, language use, but thinking patterns, thinking tendencies, language use, acquisition, and intelligence. Thinking skills, thinking tendencies, language capabilities, and intelligence. We'll hit 2 theories, Piagetian theory and a Vygotskian theory, that are indices of cognitive development. We'll do that first thing on Wednesday. Some of you have seen those theories before. Your book presents them in a way that I'm going to modify a little bit. It's really important that you're here on Wednesday for cognitive development lecture. A lot of differences from the book that I'm going to portray in class. Biological. Now, we're going to kind of lump in some aspects of biological. Yes, when you think of biological development, a lot of people think of those outward appearances, the physical development, changes in body shape, size, and functioning. Changes in body shape, size, and functioning. Physical changes in body shape, size, and functioning. But corresponding with that is actually change in personality. Personal development, looking at emotional development, the ways that you relate to others, and so when we look at biological development, I'm going to have indications of both physical and personal. Gains that are specific to certain age-based milestones of things that kids could grow into or indicate at those certain levels. Now, finally, when you think social development, you think all about widening the social circle and increased communication. Those type of aspects I would lump under personal. Social development really deals with growing into or learning roles and relationships. Changes in the way that we relate to others individually and others societally. Changes in the way that we relate to others, both individually and societally, and also the process of taking on new roles. Social development as you move from high school to college, as you move from undergraduate to graduate, certainly a transition. So within that, as we move on to the next slide, there are 2 main sources and shape of development. I guarantee all of you have heard the first one before, nature versus nurture. Nature being those aspects that are inherited, biological characteristics that are inherent to us. Nature-based influences are biological in nature. Contrasting that are nurture-based influences. So if nature is based off of heredity, biology, genetic makeup, they're specific to each individual. You're a product of the combination of your parents' DNA. Nurture has everything to do with environment, the surroundings specific to development. You're a product of your DNA is nature. You're a product of your environment and upbringing is nurture. Parenting, culture, education. All those things that make us unique and individuals. A neat theory that's going to be able to, we'll compare and contrast nature versus nurture influences across this entire unit. And then, as we present theories about development, we'll see theories that are continuous in nature. Continuous theories are theories that view development as an incremental adding of abilities. An incremental adding of abilities. And what that means is that they view development as gradual, slow, steady. It still follows a progression. It has a starting point and an end point. But they don't point out or indicate developmental specific milestones. They don't emphasize those aspects. When you look at development, it's a growth, a slow and steady growth. So even though there's theories that really take that approach, a lot of the theories that we're going to view in class for this unit are more discontinuous. Discontinuous theories stress critical periods or developmental milestones that represent distinct changes in our abilities. Critical periods or developmental milestones that are used to signify distinct changes in our abilities. Critical periods or developmental milestones that represent distinct changes in our abilities. You can point to something that couldn't be done, now it can be done, and you've reached this developmental level. Level up, so to speak, is the way they look at this. Okay, the steps and sequences, that's why that graphic is there. You see how those stairs don't really connect? That's more of a discontinuous theory. And when you see these substages or stages of development, a lot of these will categorize individuals by age, by characteristics, and have these discontinuous milestones and markers. So instead of this slow and steady, they view development acquisitional changes as abrupt. And that's how we categorize and differentiate between developmental levels and abilities. So those are two main considerations to think about. Whether a theory has its primary emphasis on nature-based influences, nurture-based influences. There are very few that strictly rely on one explanation. That makes sense, right? We know that we're a product of not only what we're born with, but also the environment that we are contained within. And a lot of the theories that view development do express it in a discontinuous manner. Now, when you look at these patterns and principles, so let's get into this first aspect. I'm going to do kind of a... you ever go to the human body exhibit? That's what we're doing right now. We're going to kind of do a cross-section. What kickstarts development into process. Some of these larger principles and patterns that govern development. Now, there's three principles I want to focus on. Number one, individual differences. That the rate of development is different. The rate of development is different across individuals. The rate of development is different across individuals. So even though we know the expected pattern, we cannot predict when it will occur because of a lot of different influences. And so when we look at these individual basic aspects or individual differences, people develop at different rates. Some of you might have been tested when you were young because you were showing a language delay. We were worried, and of course I've taught educational psychology now for almost 2 decades, which doesn't seem possible, but that's the reality. And I teach the textbook aspects, and we'll talk about language development today. My first child didn't really speak her first words until about 16 months. And for us, man, we were really, really concerned because the textbook said that she should be saying her first words at 8 to 12 months. And so you look at that as kind of a milestone. She's developmentally, and you use the term, delayed. Now, once she started speaking, she did not stop speaking. And that was just one of those characteristics, but she developed relatively late or later than would be normal for peers of her age. That's the nature of individual differences, that people develop at different rates. Number two, progression. Even though development follows a logical order, it is not predictable when it starts and stops. So progression, you're not going to skip a stage or jump into the sequence or all of a sudden grow this or have that. It's going to follow this logical order. So even though the sequence is known, its start and stop is not predictable. We can guess. In fact, some of you might have been checked out by a physician to see where you were in the growth process. Have you reached your full height? Where are you with regards to the lengthening of your bones? And can they tell how much growth you have left? What's your growth potential and some of those aspects there? So those aspects, that's progression. We know the general shape. We know the general sequence. But we don't know when it's going to start and stop. That goes hand in hand with individual differences. And finally, timing and tempo exactly reinforces those aspects that we just talked about there. Individual difference in progression means that for certain individuals, their development could be accelerated. They could finish a certain developmental processes in 16 months. Someone else might take 6 months. This deals with the rate of change as well. It can be accelerated in some, it can be stunted or delayed in others. All of us have this internal biological clock. It has nothing to do with, it just determines our individual rates. Now, beyond those principles, that's why you can look at, first of all, if you went into an elementary school, you could see vast array of differences. Vast. People who work within kids club and other type things when they have after-school programs can see evidences of different development, even though you're supposed to have the same age cohort. I run a summer camp, and I have seen vast differences amongst the gifted and talented population, all academically intelligent, but have very different developmental characteristics. Specific to physical development, though, we can observe some patterns. The first pattern is directionality. Growth has an intrinsic direction. And even though we're going to point to biological aspects, you can also bring in cognitive aspects as well. Directionality. That growth has an intrinsic direction. So we follow 3 general patterns of physical development. I'm going to name 2 of them because they have fancy names that you can use at tailgates this weekend and make yourself, you can't tailgate, by the way. But if you did, and you shouldn't, but if you did, you could toss these terms out and make yourself look really intelligent. So the first one is cephalocodal. And it refers to the general growth intrinsic direction of head to toe. In fact, if you sing that song, head, shoulders, that's what this goes along to. We grow from head to toe. We develop and integrate body systems. In fact, before birth, this doesn't have to be after birth. This is in the womb before birth. The head takes the lead in development. 2 months after conception, the head is actually half the size of the entire fetus. I will tell you there was nothing more beautiful but yet traumatic than witnessing the birth of my first child. And ladies, you don't have the vantage point that the guys do. In fact, even at the hospital, they had this X that was kind of put right here for us to stand on it. And I was excited. There's no video cameras. You can't get the Sony camcorder out of the phones or anything else. I mean, now you technically can, but you're not supposed to. And so you're sitting there and I'm watching this beautiful process. Now, mind you, my wife's first delivery, we were on hour number 16. Not 6, but 16 with our first child. And she was done with the entire process. And it starts, and all of a sudden we have the crowning achievement, right? The baby starts coming out, and I wasn't prepared for what I saw. And for the first part of this actual birth, all I really saw was, first of all, hair. So our daughter did have hair, and then it was this long cylindrical head, this cone shaped. And the longer they stay in the birth canal, the more conical their head is because of the way that they're passing through. And that head went on forever. And I was really just unsure as to what we were giving birth to. And she came out and she cried and everything was great. But she did have this elongated head that looked so much larger than the rest of her body. Now, luckily, you won't see that aspect. Gentlemen, if you choose to watch that, go for it. I will say I chose not to watch the second birth after watching the first birth. Now, I will say this, my wife's second delivery, from 16 hours down to 47 minutes. So we actually hit right in the middle on that continuum. So anyway, that's just, we barely got to the hospital in time for her to get the epidural and out. That's just his personality, though. He's eager. And you start to see that right off the bat. But that's that directionality. Now, the same pattern continues after birth. What's the first thing that babies learn how to do? Okay, turn their head from side to side. And then from there, what are other aspects? In fact, think about when you first started to move around. How did you move around initially? You were rolling over, and then did you use your arms or your legs? Okay? You used your arms. In fact, they call it the army crawl as you're kind of crawling along, because what's happening is your body is learning how to integrate muscle movements, motor movements, from head to toe. It's not till you get older that you're really able to integrate all parts of legs. When's the last thing you're able to do? Balance and coordination and walk. That's the cephalocaudal trend. Okay? So grab a couple of six-packs and then demonstrate that at a tailgate on Saturday. No, not really. But, I mean, that's one of the things that you can do, head to toe, when you look at development, in which you start to see that. And that's it occurs throughout the entire lifespan. Sophistication of intricate, fine, gross muscle. We'll talk about that when we get to there. Now, proxima distal. If cephalocaudal is from head to toe, proxima distal is known as developmental changes that occur from near to far. Near to far. Development starts and is centrated in our trunk, our core, and then it moves outward. We can use our large muscles, our limbs, before we can use our fine muscles. You can learn to wave before you can learn to tie your shoes. That's that proxima distal, from near to far. And the last pattern doesn't have a fancy name. It's just simple to complex. Simple motor movements to complex, sophisticated movements. So from simple to sophisticated. That's really cool, right? We know these patterns. Head to toe with the integration of all these movements. Near to far, this proxima distal. Those things that are centrated to us spread out as we learn to integrate and move all parts of our body. Independence of systems. Now, this is not a biology class or a science class. I'm sure all of you had to take that at one point in time, and you had to learn the systems of the human body. Am I right? The digestive system, and endocrine system, and central nervous system, and reproductive system. And here's the thing. They don't all sync up. They're not aligned. Development across those systems is not coordinated. In adolescent development, we talk about the fact that the very first system to fully mature is the reproductive system. We'll look at that in context of development in our physical development unit. For some kids, their literal growth into adulthood, you're considered an adult. Development is over from a reproductive standpoint when what? You can conceive or bear a child. It's done at 11, 10. Crazy, right? Are you done growing cognitively with your central? No. In fact, a lot of times these systems do not line up with their patterns of development. That's what independence of systems means. That even though we have this knowledge of how we're going to grow and the different functions that the systems in our human body portray, and a lot of this is endocrine system, skeletal system, cardiovascular system, central nervous system. Think about those systems that are most pertinent to human development. They are on different schedules. We actually have a fancy term for that. You ready for one more cocktail party term? Asynchronicity. Zoom room, let me hear you say that out loud. Let me just make sure you guys are here. Let me see if we can hear them. Asynchronicity.
Asynchronicity. Okay.
Microphone's not working. Let me hear you guys say it. There it is. All right, well, one person did. So asynchronicity of development, independence of systems, asynchronicity. They do not line up. And finally, this is one of the unique characteristics about humans, canalization. Canalization really refers to the resiliency and adaptability of the human body. Resiliency and adaptability. That if there's any conditions that will impede development, maybe they're physical, such as malnutrition, Maybe they're social, such as not being spoken to by parents or caregivers. You need to have language spoken to you. You need to have the ability to speak language for you to develop in a trajectory that's normal within language development. But if you have these aspects in your environment, or you have these impediments, canalization means that even if growth patterns are deflected or delayed, when conditions are right, they will continue. That even if developmental conditions, we talk about the ability to flourish or thrive in one's environment. So even if those conditions aren't present for optimal development, in fact, they might be contrary to development, will delay, stunt. That once those conditions are more favorable, positive developmental trends will continue again. Adaptability. So with that in mind, we have the building blocks. Now, this is kind of a precursor to cognition, but these have every impact on other indices of development as well. Now, one of the things that I wanted to stress in this class is that if you stress over biology, oh my God, I hated biology, Dr. J. I didn't know anything. I couldn't find what the frog lab said. You don't have to label any structures. You don't have to pinpoint. You're going to see some graphics today that show where things are in structural locations. I'm never going to have a question that says, label this structure. But I do expect you to know its function, know its role. So when you look at this, you don't have to redraw or graph some of these aspects out, but as long as you know the role and its function, then you should be fine. So neurons. Neurons are simply nerve cells. They're the fundamental units of the brain. Neurons are nerve cells. They're the fundamental units of the brain and the central nervous system. Neurons are responsible for receiving input from the environment. Receiving input from the environment. It's estimated that in our brain, we have over, and I can't do the pinky Dr. Evil, 100 billion neurons. Overproduction. We were born with far more neurons than we will ever utilize. What makes us unique as individuals and what causes physical growth, cognitive growth, are how we utilize those neurons. And it's really interesting. Neural growth is fueled by two different aspects. First of all, it has everything to do, if you skip down to the terms experience expectant and experience dependent, I'm going to talk about those aspects first. In a second, in fact, if I kind of even go down here, when you look at the cortical cross-section, I'll kind of put those two terms up there. You have neurons all across your brain. And some of these neurons are in locations in which they have a prescribed, dedicated, devoted, predetermined role and function. And those are known as experience expectant. Based off of where they are in the brain, neurons have a dedicated role. So you look right there, that green section, the occipital lobe. You have neurons in there that are responsible for inputting visual information, what you see, and then translating that into brain-readable information. All of us have these experience-expectant neurons. What makes us unique and what makes us independent are what is known as experience-dependent neurons. To use a sports term, these neurons are free agents. They can be used in a variety of different ways, and how they're used depends on how they're connected across the neural pathways. Their function and their role in your development is very much a product of how they are used and utilized. and a lot of your experience dependent neurons are located in the blue and the red regions of the brain you see up there. The parietal lobe, the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, really responsible for higher order thinking skills. So I'm going to come back to that in a second, because I'm going to go back up then, just as we talked about. You see a term on there called pruning. And this is really an interesting aspect of human development. We grow through loss. This is not some Hallmark card or anything else like that. We grow through loss. And what does that mean? Your brain seeks to ground itself in two E's: mental efficiency and mental expediency. They're survival based in nature. Mental efficiency and mental expediency. So right here, I have a microphone. All right, Thomas, I'm looking right at you. You ready? Now, this is presumably expensive. Your tuition dollars paid for this. I'm about to throw it to Thomas. Thomas, how old are you? Within like 5, you don't have to tell us your exact age, but you are 20s? 20s, he's in his 20s, okay? Now, he's in his 20s. What if I had somebody here who was, let's say my son, 7 years old, okay? Now, I'm gonna throw this presumably expensive microphone to Thomas. You ready? Because here it goes. And now, nice. Now, what did he do? Some of you got nervous. You even tried to catch it yourself. You were ready. I mean, we really had the people who acted that out. I don't know if you guys saw it on camera. So now I don't want to attempt catching it back because my face shield was on. But what had to happen for him to be able to catch that? His brain had to send a signal down to his arms, motor control, to say, catch this. Literally catch this, because you're on camera. It's being recorded. If you drop this, you're going to get a bill from the ILCB, and all of a sudden your fee statement goes up for the fall semester. I throw this to my son, who's 7 years old, and we've had our first couple of baseball practices that entail with uncertain equivalency. I throw this at him, he's going to drop it. In fact, it's probably going to hit him right in the chest, boom, and then fall to the ground. Why? Because he couldn't get his hands up fast enough to catch that. I've really been interested in watching. My son played soccer for the longest time. He's trying baseball out for the first time this year, and he's enjoying it. But I'm discovering that the hand-eye coordination, because they're doing pitching, is definitely something that in a 7-year-old population is not as sophisticated as that in a 17-year-old population. So what that means is, over a period of time, what happened? Your brain found a faster way for you to communicate and be able to respond to things quicker. Okay, reaction time increased. That's mental expediency and mental efficiency. So how does it do that? To perform any action, there are chains of neurons that are connected to each other. Whether it's a cognitive recall ability or whether it's a motor action, you have all of these neurons that are chained. Early on, you have long chains of neurons. Okay, it takes a while for information to be passed down. Babies have slower reaction times. Kids aren't as quick from a motor movement perspective than older kids. You can see a sophistication of that. So over a period of time, what happens is your brain tries to find, who uses Waze when they travel, okay? When you use Waze or Google Maps or those type things, it says recalculating, right? And what it figured out is there's a faster way to get there. Okay, there's something slowing us down. There's a way, in fact, the example I always use for this, who watched the movie Cars? Okay, of course you did. It's everyone's favorite Pixar movie. Unequivocal, no argument. Well, I don't know, there's lots of other great Pixar movies out there. But anyone remember the name of the town that Mater is from? Radiator Springs, exactly, Radiator Springs. Now, Radiator Springs used to be a thriving metropolis, right? It was the thoroughfare for people to pass through, but what happened to Radiator Springs? The highway came in, the information superhighway. And what happened? Radiator Springs died off. That's what your brain does. When it finds a faster way to connect neurons together to perform cognitive tasks or motor movements, it eliminates neurons that are not necessary. Okay, that's what's known as pruning. You ever see those bonsai trees in which simplicity is gained through those types? That's what your mind is doing this entire time. It's finding faster ways to coordinate thought and action, expediency and efficiency, growth through loss. Apoptosis means the literal death of a brain cell. It's the use it or lose it principle. If we don't use a brain cell in our body because it doesn't have electrical stimulation and the food and nourishment it needs, it's going to die away. However, those connections that are used the most often will continue to grow and flourish. And the way that neurons communicate is they send these electrical impulses across each other. And through this process of pruning, we get these pretty sophisticated information superhighways. Your brain is really good about reading which highways are used the most often. Texas Department of Transportation, TxDOT, does the same thing. It knows most people in Texas travel on 35, 20, 45, those highways. So when they get highway dollars, where do they put it? On the roads that are used the most often. That's why 35 has been under construction forever, for your lifetime. Am I right? People from Dallas, you know exactly what I'm talking about there. They use all their money. That's what your brain does. Myelination. Myelin is a substance that increases communication. It literally is fat. Okay? It's a superconductor of electricity. And so neurons that are used the most often receive this coating of this myelin. It goes at the end of the neurons, the axons and the dendrites, those connectivity. You have the synapse in the middle. And it helps to speed and pass that information on faster. Now, who here watches Grey's Anatomy? Okay? McDreamy, McSteamy, they're all dead, spoiler alert. But when you really kind of get down to it, Grey's Anatomy is actually not a very good term for a surgeon to have. Because you can see how connected your brain is by looking at its color. And what happens is, as this myelin takes shape, your brain grows slightly, it thickens. Why? Because this myelin adds to the ends of these dendrites and your brain thickens. When it thickens, it changes from gray to white. And if you actually did a lobotomy of a child or a college student, you could actually tell how cognitively developed they are by looking at where their brain is the thickest, how thick it is based off its color and based off its size. So here's the thing about development. We're not growing any new neurons. Well, actually, in adolescence, we do. The unique fact about adolescence, you have an overproduction of neurons in a specific region of the brain, that pink brain right there. But really, most cognitive growth is fueled by loss, which is kind of crazy, right? And then growth, it's not like the brain is a group. We gain in leg size and all that. No, it's slight growth. It's slight growth. You don't see this massive increase of your head size because your brain is expanding. What happens is the thickening. So cells that are wired together, they'll fire together. They send these impulses on. They're myelinated. The glial cells are the ones responsible for secreting this myelin onto these information superhighways that are used the most often. And that's how our brain takes shape individually. Now let's go back then to experience expectant and experience dependent, because this happened at my household over the weekend. My wife's tank, she drives a Nissan Armada. I really think it could be used in warfare. It's just this massive hunk of a vehicle that I can't stand driving. I have a sedan. My wife has got this car, but its tire was flat. Now, how many of you guys could actually, if necessary, if after class today, you ended up pulling out of the garage, change a flat tire? Some of you are raising your hand. I thought I could. I attempted that. The jack was not working with me. I couldn't get the crank to work, and so I had to do the humiliating, I made my wife call, phone call of getting someone out there, and it was really kind of humbling when they took this thing, and they like, this is 1, 2, 3, and the car was raised up, and we got the spare on. I think I could have done it if I was doing my car. I gave it the good old Aggie try, and then now some of you were taught that skill by your parents, or you just learned it because of, and so you have that. You had that ability. Some of you have no ability whatsoever, mechanical ability whatsoever. Your only skill in that situation is dialing AAA. I mean, literally the motor to get that fixed. That's the difference between experience dependent. Same thing when it comes to extracurriculars. And we've talked about this in class a little bit. I read your React papers. A lot of you were involved in dance, gymnastics, those type things. Maybe you have great artistic ability. Why? You've learned to hone those skills. I was in the band. I played saxophone, but I have muscle memory for an embouchure, learning how to blow wind through an instrument. Finger movements for playing very fast passages. Sports, the same type thing. You have the kinesthetic memory, muscle memory for swinging a golf club or a baseball. And all of that is dependent upon what? Your personal experiences. That's why our brains become individualized. Neurons will connect in different ways. We'll use neurons in different parts of our body. Some of us are heavy in our visuospatial skills. We've used those a lot. Hunters, being able to visualize that aspect and put the right amount of pressure on the trigger. That's muscle, it's kinesthetic and memory. Some of us are linguistic in nature. That's where individual development occurs. How we utilize and integrate experience-dependent neurons into our everyday life. And there's critical periods to learn new skills. That's why we're starting my son off in baseball now. It's easier to pick it up at 7 than it would be at later on in life. It's easier to learn a foreign language at an early age than it is later on in life. It's all about how you use and integrate these experience-dependent neurons. But those will fuel individual growth. It's really cool. And it's kind of contrary to popular notion. We gain through loss. Because our brain is rooted in this mental expediency and efficiency. Again, this is a graphic. What I want to point to you on this graphic is not so much the labeling aspect, but here's what we know about the pattern of development. Remember we said that there are patterns. And the way that the brain grows is really I'm going to try this on the whiteboard. You guys ready for some art, some abstract art? Because I am. So get that picture of the brain in your mind. And when we look at those aspects, all right, we got red. Let's see what we've got. Okay. So the brainstem, those aspects of the brain that you saw just at the base are responsible for everyday regulatory heart rate, digestion, breathing, those things necessary for life.
Low battery.
Okay, and you start seeing these neuron pathways, and then we bring in aspects of visual perception. And those come in second, and we bring in these aspects here. And then all of a sudden, we've got visual aspects that are coming on here, and we start bringing in the coordination.
Low battery.
What happens is these connections get larger and larger, and our brain becomes more connected. These things, we can see growth and patterns. And the last part of our brain,
low battery,
become fully integrated, occurs right here. Now, mind you, this looks like what punctuation? A question. By the way,
low battery.
Oh, God. Better than my normal curve, right? I'm better at dots and slashes than I am anything else. But the pathways, when you look at the thickening of the brain, the way that these neurons become increasingly connected in more sophisticated ways follows kind of this bottom up and then back to front. The very last part of the brain to become fully integrated in the thought processes is right here. Now, it is of no surprise that this is the prefrontal cortex. And this prefrontal cortex is responsible for intuition, decision-making, logical thought. It's the part of the brain that most scientists agree does not fully develop until the age of 25, 24, 25, 26. Have you ever wondered, if you've gone out of town, why you as a 20-year-old are not allowed to rent a car? It's because there's scientific knowledge that your risk-taking is still pretty high because your frontal lobe, your prefrontal cortex, has not fully been integrated into the holistic aspect of decision-making. Now, mind you, I'm not saying that you're growing your frontal lobe at this point in time. What we do know, and this is really fascinating, that there's only one other period of time in which we have a second wave of neuron production. For the most part, development has been fueled by the loss of existing neurons. When you get to puberty, there's a new wave of overproduction, and it occurs right up there in that region. We add new neurons, and those neurons have never been connected before, and we have to integrate them into daily life. They have every role and function in executive functioning, logical decision-making, impeding risk-taking. There's scientific evidence. If you have something that you wish you did not do, hashtag TwillyFest 2020, then you could actually blame it on the fact that you had an immature, not fully developed brain. And I've seen people who've gone to court with that argument, and more often than not, it is a rational defense supported by scientific evidence. I'm not saying you're going to get out of a speeding ticket because of that, but it is really interesting that that's that last part of the brain to fully integrate. That part right there. So anyway, question mark. And that's really interesting because when you look at growth in this gray matter to white matter, the thickening of the brain occurs in this pattern and follows through that logical pattern and conclusion. And so it makes no surprise that when you look at the role here, occipital sight, you've got these aspects with hearing here in the middle. The very last section here, thinking, memory, behavior, and movement. Now, of course, you will integrate some of these aspects early on, but that very last part, that prefrontal cortex, is really where you see a lot of this cognitive growth as we get into older adolescence and then adulthood. So the last aspect we're going to talk about for today is language development. There's just not enough time in our cognition unit. We're going to kind of kick off our cognition unit a little bit early by covering language development today. And this is where I differentiate from your book a little bit, because your book tosses out some terms and has some sequences, but they don't put in a lot of the substages specific to development. Now, there's two different acquisition-based theories on language development. We have a nativist theorist, and nativist theories stress that language development is based off of nature. The nativist view, I put Noam Chomsky up there. I would probably not ever recall or make you recall his particular name. It's tied to him. It's linked to him. He's kind of the nativist individual who champions this notion. But they say that we're equipped at birth with something called the language acquisition device. Language acquisition device. So these are domain-specific mental structures dedicated to learning language. We are hardwired, literally, according to the nativist approach, with everything that we need to learn a language. Now you have other people who argue, nope, language acquisition really can be viewed as an empiricist approach. And they say, our brain is our brain. It doesn't really necessarily depend on specific cognitive structures. That's what's necessary to learn a language is environmental enrichment. Having language spoken to you. How children acquire language skills from an early age because it's a learned behavior within a social context. So who's right? Trick question. They both are. What we know through brain imaging and some of these advanced kind of CAT scans and other PET scans, when you look at the lighting of the brain, we know that there are two structures that have neurons assigned to two specific tasks. Now, the yellow is not showing up great here in the auditorium, but when we look at Broca's area, it has everything to do with expressive vocabulary. Expressive vocabulary means the words that you can speak. The words that you can speak. Broca's area. You can see where it is in the brain. I've got it highlighted there in yellow for a reason. This yellow structure right here. Now, back here, we have Wernicke's area. This is known as receptive vocabulary. Receptive vocabulary is the words that you can understand. Words that you can understand. So it makes sense then, with everything we just diagrammed, with my brilliant abstract art of the way that our brain connects, which one do we have the capability of first? Receptive. We understand more than we can speak. Receptive ability for language, listening and interpreting what the meaning of a word is, occurs first, is integrated first. Very young kids know the meaning of no. They've heard that probably a lot. but it's not until later to where they're actually able to express that word themselves. And so what my daughter was showing is a delay in expressive vocabulary. But when they tested her on picture recognition, can you point to the dog? Can you point to the circle? Can you point to the color red? And had her indicate that, she could do it all. And so you can look at two different aspects. So who's right? Are there structures associated with learning language? Yes, there are. It's not this be-all, fix-all, this massive language acquisition device. But there are brain structures with experienced, expectant neurons that are dedicated to either receptive vocabulary or expressive vocabulary. And the rate at which we develop has everything to do with their positioning. Also, our ability to speak and pronounce words itself. So therefore, it makes sense when we look at these cute pictures right here. Language development. Milestones, a discontinuous view. Now this jumps over when you look at your readings for today. This is kind of where we take that jump, slight jump into this next module. We're going to look at two year periods of critical development. From birth to 2 years, a lot of what is being built up is receptive vocabulary. It has everything to do, your receptive vocabulary has a lot to do with how much language you've been exposed to in your environment. Language is learned in humans according to what most theorists would describe as child-directed speak. Child-directed speech. It's really a non-standard form of communication. I would never walk into a faculty meeting, turn in and say, do you want a cookie? Do you want a cookie? Who wants a cookie? What does it use? It uses repetitive. You repeat words over and over again. Repetitive questioning. Melodic pitch. You vary the tone, the inflection. Some of you have, in fact, if you want to see what your mommy and daddy voice is, look at how you communicate to your pets or to your roommates, whichever one. Who's a good boy? That's child-directed speech. What do you also do? You slow down your rate of speech. Now, some of you are like, Dr. J, you need more child-directed speech when you deliver lectures. Slow it down. Slow, deliberate tempo. Simplified vocabulary. Melodic pitch. Repetitive question. These kids are getting the building blocks of language. When you slow speech down, they can pick up what are known as distinct sounds. Phonemes. Phonemes is a unit in a language, a unit of sound in a specified language. A unit of sound in a specified language. In fact, within a language, it's the smallest unit of sound that carries meaning. We use phonemes to build words. Phonemes are like ba, 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 da, 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 ma, 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 ma. We learn how to make certain sounds that are unique to what? The English language. Now, not all sounds that are unique to the English language are duplicated in other languages. Anyone here have trouble rolling their R's in Espanol? R. Being able to say that. Some of you really struggled in Spanish class because you could not produce that ñ, R, and other type sounds. Why? Because those were not phonemes that you heard. And so we become accustomed to hearing a certain language type through the process of what is known as perceptual tuning. Perceptual tuning is learning what carries meaning and what can be filtered out. The process of becoming less sensitive over time to stimuli or sounds that are not in a typical environment. Perceptual tuning. The process of becoming less sensitive over time to stimuli or sounds that are not in our typical environment. If you've ever seen a Charlie Brown cartoon, this indicates perceptual tuning perfectly because the teacher is speaking It sounds like gibberish. It doesn't mean anything. We're not used to hearing that. That's perceptual tuning. Now, when you hear syllables and sounds that you're used to, you're able to attune to those. We tend to less focus on sounds that we don't hear in our everyday environment. That's why it's really critical if you want to raise a child that speaks multiple languages. At an early age, we have universal adaptability. And what that means is universal adaptability means you can take any kid and put them into any environment and they can learn to speak that language. Doesn't matter who they've been born to, as long as they're hearing it on a daily basis, they'll be able to reproduce those sounds. After a period of time, generally thought to be about 18 months, universal adaptability nosedives. We become more hardened and developmentally attuned to the sounds that we hear the most often. So universal adaptability is that magic period in which a child can learn and reproduce sounds from any environment. So if you want to raise a child that speaks, and my kids go to a trilingual school, they're learning Spanish, they're learning Mandarin. We can't speak it very well, but it's interesting to hear the teachers communicate. And it's really interesting to hear my son count in Mandarin and say the days of the week in Mandarin. We're just nodding because we're helping them with their homework in which we have no idea what they literally are saying at that point in time. But they're getting it. My young son is picking it up faster than my daughter. My son started in kindergarten at the age of 6. My daughter started really at 5th grade with this, and so is really kind of struggling with some of the vocabulary and this just expositional knowledge that she's had to do. But universal adaptability is the ability to reproduce any sounds. It starts declining at 18 months, dramatically drops off. Why? Because you've been in that language learning process for a longer period of time. 2 to 4 years, telegraphic speech. What has happened? Really, when we get to kind of this child-directed speech, the first words appear generally. Most kids have, and your book talks about vocabulary and how much vocabulary that you have at certain ages. Generally, about 8 to 12 months, you start seeing the first word. Vocabulary increases from there. And so during this child-directed speech, kids are hearing, they're picking up sounds, they're able to reproduce some of them. In fact, gentlemen, don't ever take pride in the fact that your son or daughter can say da 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 before, because based off of muscle memory and movement, it's easier for them to say. And in fact, just do it yourself. Da da da, easier to say than ma ma ma. You hear what you have to use. So, ladies, don't take it personal. It's just our phonomic development. It's easier to say da 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 and repeat that than it is ma 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 ma. It's just the way that we percussively sound with those words. But then we move to telegraphic speech. So these kids are communicating at this point in time, but it's just basic syllables. Now, when we get to telegraphic speech, it's the middle stage in early language development, when children can start forming simple sentences on their own. Vocabulary is growing, words are becoming commonplace. And we move from phonemes, so syllables, to full words themselves. Simple words: dog, cat, ball. Those represent morphemic knowledge. And a lot about what kids learn during this time is through not repetitive repeating of things to them, but they will ask repetitive questions. Why do dogs have 2 ears? I don't know. Why do cats exist? I don't know. They ask those questions, but now that might be more sophisticated. What you start to see with regards to this is that these kids say, me want cookie. I want, me want. They don't have the language syntax and grammar and pragmatics down, but they can start putting words together to communicate. And so telegraphic speech is when they're actually able, it's a form of communication that consists of simple 3, 2, more word sentences. And these sentences typically have 2 things, a noun and a verb, and its understanding can be derived. It might not be phrased correctly, but it's got a noun, me, I, me go, me want. And then sometimes you've got another noun is there, me want cookie, me want out, me want no, those aspects there. But those are morphemes. These are small syllabic words that we learn to use and to integrate. We've heard people say them, we can emulate them, we repeat, and we start learning through questioning. And then finally, from 4 to 6 years, we enter into what is known as that ramping up of the formal language process, in which we learn how to properly communicate within a language. Here you start representing words with symbols. We'll talk about semiotic functioning when we get to cognitive development. We know what the letter A looks like, B looks like. You can only imagine how much more difficult that might be in a character-based language, and how those all characters go together. You've got 3 aspects here. Grammar, a set of rules that dictate how communication can be combined. What most kids have to learn is syntax, the rules that govern the order of words. We're still working on my 7-year-old on that. They'll say me want, and nope, I want. And finally, pragmatics, knowledge of practical aspects of using language. Appropriate use of language to communicate within a social environment and social setting. And that's where we're going to end today. Language can follow these 2-year milestones. On Wednesday, we're going to dive into cognitive development. We're going to profile 2 theories. I think we'll have time to, for sure, get through Piagetian theory, cognitive development in the view of a constructivist perspective, and then a social constructivist perspective as well, from Lev Vygotsky. So I think you're going to find it interesting. This is, I think, a lot of information, but it's also interesting information because it governs human development. And maybe you learned something new today. Maybe you'll get a cocktail term or tailgate term that you can toss out and practice with over the coming week. One last reminder. So we're done a little bit early today. Tonight, I'll be sending out an email. If you want to take the Intercultural Development Inventory, IDI, I need to know. I need a pretty quick response. I'll open that up for responses through tomorrow. It takes a couple of days for those to be generated. By Friday, I'll send you out a link to take the test. Devote about 45 minutes. Really think about the questions for them to be meaningful. And then if you take that, we have to convene for you to get your results. And so the debriefing is scheduled for September 28th. Your intro projects are due September 28th. That's an eCampus submission. You don't have to come to class for that. I will say that you need to have several aspects with that. I need to see your survey, a screenshot of exactly what your survey looks like, how you asked those questions. That needs to be a separate aspect. I need to see some form of data analysis. So Kevin had pointed out that on the graduate level, it cut that off. If you have charts and graphs embedded that shows the number of people who took the survey, that's fine. I don't need a separate spreadsheet. If you don't have that, I need some way to categorize responses. How many people took your survey, and then finally, of course, your write-up. Your write-up that communicates all of those aspects, the introduction, the 6 analyses of questions, and the conclusion there at the very end. Hard deadline due at 5:35 on the 28th. Graduate students will convene on that day to talk about your development project, and anybody who takes the IDI will convene on that day for the first 10-15 minutes just to make sense of your results and things you can do to help yourself grow in those cross-cultural competencies. So again, don't worry about cost. I've got it covered. Okay, I've got you covered. This is not anything that's going to cost you any extra tuition. It's not going to come out of my personal bank account, but I've got some money for professional development, and I think that's a good way to use it if you guys would like to have your results. There's no bonus points. This is not anything that's tied to any of that. It's just if you want to know so you can grow in cultural awareness, I'd be happy to provide that opportunity for you. So, all right, have a good one. We'll see you on Wednesday. Go Stars tonight.